in welcoming the Honorable Robert Sumwalt. Mr. Chairman, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lita, for that very nice introduction. It is a pleasure. Ni hao, and good morning. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you, and thank you very much. I want to talk to you, and certainly I want to thank everyone who's been involved in planning this and sponsoring this, and thank you for your attendance on this very important day. I want to talk to you about a topic that's extremely interesting and very important to me, and that's professionalism and safety culture. This is a Hawker 700 that crashed a few years ago, and what we found is that there was not professionalism within the cockpit, and there was not a positive safety culture within the charter operator. 9 people lost their lives on this tragic event. I started flying when I was 17 years old, and while I was still in college, I started flying business aviation in a Piper Navajo, and did that for a few years, and then got hired by an airline and flew for an airline for 24 years, and then back to business aviation after I left the airline. And so I believe I really understand the importance of business aviation and how it can get people where they need to go to airports that are not necessarily served by the airlines. I want to talk to you a little bit about what we do at the Ntsb, but before that, yes, this is a business jet. It happens to be owned by the United States of America, the government, but it is in fact a business jet. And we are able to use this airplane to take us to airports where there have been crashes nearby, places that otherwise it would take us all day long to get to, we can get to very quickly with business aviation. And I know that Doug Carr from NBAA later this morning will be talking more about the value of business aviation. We at the Ntsb investigate all modes of transportation accidents, aviation. We investigate selected rail accidents, highway-related accidents, marine accidents, and even pipeline accidents, because it's a mode of transporting a product, just like you might transport oil on a truck or on rail, you transport that product through pipeline as well. We have a board made up of 5 presidential appointees appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the US Senate. But I tell you, the real strength of the agency is our 400 dedicated, very dedicated employees who do the investigations. So the first part of the topic is professionalism, maintaining the right attitude. And this standby attitude indicator is from a citation, Cessna citation, Textron citation. It happened a few years ago before Cessna was called Textron. But you can see the attitude in which this aircraft impacted the terrain. And we found that there was truly, unfortunately, a lack of professionalism in that cockpit that led to the crash. My slides are not advancing, so let me try it this way. There you go. Here's another, let's see here. Yeah. So here's another slide of a regional jet. It was in fact operated by a regional airline, but it was on a ferry flight for just the 2 pilots. They decided that they wanted to take the airplane to 41,000 feet. Unfortunately, they stalled the airplane. Both engines quit because of the stall, the inefficient airflow through the engines. Both engines quit. They could not get the engines restarted, and they attempted to dead stick to an airport. It was at nighttime, and unfortunately, they did not make the airport. They crashed and both died. Not sure why my slides are not advancing, so let me work on that just for a moment. All right. What we found was the pilot's unprofessional behavior, deviations from SOPs, standard operating procedures, poor airmanship, which resulted in an in-flight emergency from which they were unable to recover. We have seen, unfortunately, over the years, we have seen more accidents than I'm happy to say related to unprofessional behavior. As a professional aviator myself, it pains me when we see accidents like this. Now, I want to talk to you for a moment about what appears to be a very impressive operation. Beautiful G4, owned and operated by, it was owned by a wealthy individual. The captain, the pilot, the chief pilot had worked for this private individual who owned the airplane. He had worked there for about 27 or 28 years. The co-pilot had worked for this company for 11 years, and the flight attendant had been there for around 16 years. Now think about that. In at least in the United States, we don't see individuals staying with a company like this that just owns one airplane, a privately owned jet. We don't see them staying for 28 years or 16 years or 11 years. So it must have been a very good operator, a very good company to work for. They had what appeared to be a very professional operation, a full-time crew, impeccable maintenance, very good maintenance, high training standards, going above the minimum standards, and very positive audit comments. They had an audit 2 years before, and I'll show you some of those audit comments in just a few minutes. Let's see. I want you to look at these audit comments. These audits for an AsBAA audit were made 2 years before. The SMS of this operator is well developed. The safety management system of this operator is well developed. Best practices are consistently employed in all facets of the program. Continuous SMS improvements is actively pursued. The flight operations manual is remarkably well written and comprehensive, and the safety culture within the department is shared among all team members. Open reporting of hazards is consistently encouraged by management, and it's a solid safety program which is maturing very nicely. So it looks like this is an operation that's doing all the right things. I heard that the chief pilot was somebody who would go frequently to safety seminars and was very proud of his operation and was trying to do the right things, apparently. I think because of jet lag, my computer is not at all happy, so we'll just keep trying to slide these slides. Okay, come on. It's going to work this time. You watch. Maybe. I thought it was going to work so well. Let's try this one more time. Okay. But unfortunately, here's how that Gulfstream ended up. It overran a runway and ended up crossing this small river, catching fire. All 7 occupants of the airplane survived or did not survive. They were all killed in the post-crash fire. What did we learn about that? Well, let's talk about what the NTSB learned. One of the things we learned was that the flight crew failed to disengage this gust lock before takeoff. Now, you know what that means. It means the flight controls were locked. So when they attempted to rotate to take off, they could not pull back on the control column. What we did learn also from the cockpit voice recorder is none of the 5 manufacturer specified checklists were verbalized on the accident. They did not at least read out loud the checklist. And by the way, this gust lock, I think, is mentioned a couple of times on the checklist, as well as a full flight control check is mentioned on the before takeoff checklist. But what we learned, unfortunately, was that this crew had not accomplished a complete flight control check for 173 of the past 175 flights. Now, I may have mistakenly failed to do a flight control check. I don't know if I ever did, because if I did, I would not have realized it because I forgot about it. But I don't think I ever intentionally said, oh, I'm not going to do the flight control check, especially on an airplane that has a gust lock, that if you forgot to release it, it could cause great problems. You hear me pressing the advanced slide button. And I don't know, just bear with me as these slides tend to do. Okay, now I'm going to show a video in just an animation in just a moment. This is a runway that is just under 2,200 meters in length. They attempted to, here, they're saying they couldn't get something. They come to V1. When they attempt to rotate, that's when they say steer lock is on. And he said it, let's count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times over the next 8 seconds. Now, if you've discovered now I realize we should not reject a takeoff past V1 unless what? Unless we have reason to believe that the airplane is not going to fly. So I would say that this would be a good time to reject the takeoff. Here's where they discovered that, right at about, and I can't see because it's being blocked by something, right here at around, 3,200 meters. Let's back this up. They realized the steer lock was on. Now, instead of rejecting, they continued to accelerate at 3 to 4 knots per second, continuing to go down the runway. Finally, when they got to this point, instead of rejecting, they attempted to pull the flight power shutoff valve, which would remove hydraulic pressure from the flight controls, which has been a trick that some Gulfstream pilots knew, that if you failed to release the gust lock before starting the engines, that was a way that you could remove hydraulic pressure and then release the gust lock. So instead of rejecting, they continued. Finally, at this point, they put the brakes on, retarded the throttles. They applied thrust reversers once they were into the runway overrun. And unfortunately, this is the river that they went across. Now I'm going to show an animation and let's watch it. It's very short.
As the airplane taxied onto the runway, the flight crew discussed the blue rudder limit advisory message, consistent with the gust lock still engaged. After the brakes were released, the throttles were advanced manually until they reached a restriction which corresponded to an engine pressure ratio of about 1.4. The auto throttles were engaged. The second in command called out that the airplane had reached a speed of 80 knots. The second in command stated the airplane had reached takeoff decision speed, V1. One of the pilots activated the flight power shutoff valve, likely in an attempt to release the gust lock. Brake pressure started to rise. The thrust reversers were deployed. The airplane collided with runway lighting and a localizer antenna and passed through the airport's perimeter fence, before coming to rest in a ravine formed by the Shawsheen River. The main wreckage came to rest about 850 feet past the end of the paved runway overrun and was destroyed by a post-crash fire.
So there you see it. What did the investigation reveal? From the report, the NTSB's report, it said the probable cause of the accident was the flight crew members' failure to perform the flight control check before takeoff and their attempt to take off with the gust lock system engaged and their delayed execution of a rejected takeoff after they became aware that the flight controls were locked. Contributing to the accident were the flight crew's habitual non-compliance with checklists. Professionals do not habitually not comply with checklists, but yet we know that this crew on 173 out of the past 175 flights did not do a full flight control check. And we also found that there was a problem with the gust lock and throttle interface system. It's supposed to have prevented the throttles from advancing very far with the gust lock engaged, but we found that that gust lock system on the G4 at the time did not meet the certification standards. They were able to push the power up a good bit further than they should have been able to with the gust lock engaged. So my question is, why would an experienced flight crew perform this way? It's a good question. And the NTSB explained it this way: procedural drift. When flight crew members perform a routine check repeatedly over a long period of time and never encounter an example of its effectiveness as a safety protection, they may experience a decreased perception of the check's importance. As a result, they may begin to skip the check and reallocate their efforts towards other goals that they regard as more important. And think about that. This makes sense to me. How often, when you do a flight control check, do you discover a problem? I don't think I've ever done a flight control check and found, oh, the gust lock is still engaged, or the flight controls are binding and I can't move them. Of the 14,000 flight hours that I have and countless flight control checks, I don't think I've ever experienced a problem. So over time, I might think, well, that's really not a very important check, so I don't really need to do it. And so let me continue. Such changes can lead to the development of a new group norms about what is expected and an increasing mismatch between the written guidance and actual operating performance. This increasing mismatch has been described as procedural drift. We start drifting away from the procedures. Another term that I've heard to describe it is a normalization of deviance. We normalize the deviation. We get so used to doing it, so used to deviating, that appears to be the new norm for us. A word that I would use to describe it is simply complacency, where we get a false feeling of security, a false feeling of safety. And we start to be smug, and we forget about that complacency, and we're very comfortable when we should not be comfortable. So let me ask you, when we hear jokes on the cockpit voice recorder, when we hear bad words on the cockpit voice recorder, how does it sound? This is the NTSB's cockpit voice recorder lab, where our investigators gather to listen to those very sad cockpit voice recorders when investigating a crash. So here's one here where, see these little hashtags here? These are words that you would not really want your mother to hear. And I'll admit, I have been known on occasions to say words that I probably should not, words that I would not say when I go to church, words I would not want my mother to hear. So I'm not trying to say that in itself is necessarily bad. But let me give you an example. This was a crew of a jet stream. They crashed on a dark night, cloudy night, and killed about 13 people in a jet stream. Now, on a jet stream, I don't think there's a hard cockpit door. It's probably a curtain. And so, of course, if the passengers are making a lot of noise in the back, it would be noisy in the cockpit. And so these guys decided to make it sort of a funny thing. And so the co-pilot says, you know, I think you're going to need to just shut the insert bad word up. You know, I think we're just going to need to shut the blank up. And then he says, the captain says, love to poke my head back around there and say, you know, ladies and gentlemen, we've thought about it. It's unanimous up here. We've come to the conclusion that you people should all shut the blank up. And I'm sure to those guys, it was very funny. Now think about it. These guys, these pilots are seconds away from crashing that airplane into the ground and killing the passengers who have paid for their flight. But these guys thought it was funny. But I'll be willing to bet that when we heard it on the cockpit voice recorder, nobody laughed. This was a Learjet that was going into a New York airport a few years ago, and you can see it right at the moment of impact. They lost control on approach. They were only on a flight that was about 28 minutes long. And on that 28-minute flight, I think I counted 130 of these bad words. Now, I don't know what these words are, but think about that. For a 28-minute flight, about 130 obscene cuss words. And here's one here where in one sentence, the pilot uses 1, 2, 3, 4 cuss words. This is not professional. It's not a professional way to conduct a flight. It does not sound real good for those of us that after the fact have to go back and listen to it. I'm not a perfect person. Like I say, I've been known to say a word when I'm frustrated. But I always tried to remember that right above me was a microphone and it was recording everything I was saying. And I never wanted my wife and daughter to have to read in the paper the bad things that I had said. So we've just talked about professionalism. Let's talk about the other part of the presentation, and that is safety culture. It's a word we hear a lot these days. This was a crash. It's hard to read the yellow writing there, but this was a helicopter EMS, helicopter air ambulance flight that crashed 2 years ago, and we finished the investigation about a year ago. And one of the things that we found was Survival Flight, that's the company, Survival Flight's poor safety culture likely influenced the accident pilot's decision to conduct the accident flight. The weather was not great, and yet they took off. In fact, we later learned that three other air ambulance operators had turned down the flight, but this company accepted it. So here's another one. This was a search and rescue mission, and it didn't turn out very well. It killed the person that they went to rescue, along with the pilot. Contributing to the accident was an organizational culture that prioritized mission execution over aviation safety. So what is safety culture? There's certainly a lot of definitions about safety culture, but here's one that I like. It's from the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and it says that safety culture is the core values and behaviors resulting from a collective commitment by the leaders and individuals to emphasize safety over competing goals, to ensure protection of the people and the environment. There's a lot packed into that one sentence. Safety is a core value of the company. Core values don't change. Priorities, I always hear people say, safety is our top priority. Well, priorities come and go, but your core values, that is the fabric of the organization. Those don't change. And another thing that says is resulting from a collective commitment by leaders and individuals. It's not just the pilots, it's not just the mechanics, it's everybody in the organization. It's the CEO, it's the vice president of finance, it's the people on the front line. Everybody has this collective commitment to emphasize safety over competing goals. Now, granted, we always will have competing goals. The boss always is going to want to get to his meeting. There's always going to be pressure about how much is this costing us? How much is this maintenance costing us? In the airlines, we had on-time pressure. We always want to be on time. We don't want to cancel flights if we don't have to, because that's costing us money. But those things those conversations need to occur. But safety always has to have a seat at the table. So with that backdrop of the definition of safety culture, let me ask you something. I don't want you to nod your head or to shake your head. Don't do that. Don't answer out loud, but think about this for just a moment. Do you have a good safety culture? I want to go now to the words of Professor James Reason. Now, many of you have heard of Jim Reason. You have read his books on human error and organizational accidents. I would imagine most people have seen or talked about the Swiss cheese model. That was all invented by Dr. Jim Reason. And so here's what Dr. Reason says to this question. Do you have a good safety culture? He says, it is worth pointing out that if you are convinced that your organization has a good safety culture, you are almost certainly mistaken. Safety culture is something that is striven for, but rarely attained. It is the process. It's the process that is more important than the product. What do I think he's really saying here? I think he's saying, yes, we certainly hope that you have a good safety culture, but don't ever really believe that, because once you believe you're good, you'll get complacent, you'll get lazy. And when that happens, something bad happens. It's like the G4 that we saw earlier. They must have thought they were very good. And by all outward appearances, they were good. But a friend of mine says, you can always fool the auditors, but never fool yourself. And I think that's what happened in that case. I think those pilots thought they were really good. They had really good audit findings, but yet they fooled themselves into thinking they were better than they really were. And the idea of a safety culture being striven for rather than attaining it, yeah, we hope you have the safety culture, but the fact that you're jumping for it, that you're reaching for it each and every day, that is good. That keeps us on our toes. And it is a journey anyway. It's not like you're safe or you're not. It's a constant, It's a constant journey. And he therefore goes on to say that it's the process that's more important than thinking you reach it. Oh, here we go again. All right, let's see if we can flip this slide. Now, a good friend of mine, and I was texting with him earlier today, a great friend of mine, he's written books on safety leadership. And he says, Jim Schultz is his name, he flew F-4 Phantoms in the Air Force. With good safety performance, people and organizations can easily become complacent. There's that word again, complacent. Don't ever believe that a lack of accidents means you are safe. And to counter this complacency, there must be a leadership obsession with continuous improvement. I did run a Fortune 500 flight department when I left the airline. And I would wake up in the middle of the night at 3 o'clock in the morning, sweating, thinking, oh my God, I can't let that happen here. And I think it was that chronic unease that would allow me to make sure that we were operating as safely as we could. Now, let me give you a few tips to avoid something that looks like this. Think of the letters NTSB. Now, normally we think of those letters as meaning National Transportation Safety Board. But in this case, think of each of these letters as meaning something else. N stands for negative publicity avoidance. There was a pilot that crashed this DC-9 that said, you never know which flight your career will be judged. And he was right. He crashed this DC-9. He was an F-16 pilot, and yet he had this crash. This is what he'll be remembered for. The pilot of the jet stream that we saw where they were laughing about the passengers. The captain, I met his sister-in-law a few years later, and she said he was such a good guy. Everybody loved him. But that's not what people are going to remember him for. They're going to remember him for the flight where he died along with 12 others. Oh boy. Okay. How would you like for your name to be plastered on the front page of the paper? Warning, pilot error. Or like this, Pilots Act. Pilots Act might have led to crash. I've always thought, if you were in a crash, what would the accident investigation authorities have to say about it? What would your friends say? This was in Singapore in the Raffles Hotel, having a beer with my 3 cousins, one of which lives in Singapore. How would it be if your neighbors, what would your neighbors think if they looked outside and that quiet little street that you lived on looked like this with satellite antennas out front? And finally, what would your family think? I always tried to keep that in mind. It's something very important to keep in mind. The T stands for take the most conservative approach. Whenever you're faced with a tough decision, I found just take the most conservative approach. I was a very young captain at the airline. I was very lucky. The airline was expanding quickly. At 27 years old, I was an airline captain for a major airline. The good news is I was a very young captain. The bad news was I was a very young captain. I didn't have a lot of experience because things were moving quickly. I think I was a captain in less than 3 years. Most other people right before me had been in the right seat for 12 years before they were a captain. So one thing I learned early in life that helped keep me out of trouble, when you've got to make a decision, just take the conservative approach. Should you de-ice or don't de-ice? Should you divert or should you continue? Should you add more fuel or should you risk a minimum fuel landing? Take the pressure off of yourself and go with the more conservative option. That kept me out of a lot of trouble. And I got in enough trouble without following this rule sometimes. All right, buy batteries for your mouse next time, I guess, is the lesson for me. I don't know what's going on. The S stands for Standard Operating Procedures Adherence. Follow your SOPs. This is a study that was done by Boeing back in 1993. It's a very busy slide, but Boeing conducted a study where they looked at 138 accidents that resulted in nearly 5,700 fatalities. And they said, what could have prevented this accident for each one that they looked at? And I want you to look. The top accident prevention strategy was the pilot flying adherence to SOPs, pilot flying adherence to procedures. Almost half of the 138 accidents that Boeing looked at could have been prevented if the pilot flying had adhered to procedures. And the third most prevalent accident prevention strategy was the pilot not flying or pilot monitoring adherence to procedures. That should say something right there. Following procedures is very important. Now, LOSA, Line Operational Safety Audit. This is where they put trained observers on airline jump seats and they go out and observe how crews manage their flights. They're not there to give check rides, just collect data. And LOSA data revealed that compared to crews who followed standard operating procedures, the crew members who deliberately, who intentionally deviated from procedures, averaged making 3 times more errors. They mismanaged more errors, and they found themselves in more undesirable situations in the airplane. Things like altitude deviations, runway incursions, lining up for the wrong runway. So let's go back to this again. The crews who intentionally deviated from procedures, they made more errors by a factor of 3. They mismanaged more errors. Yes, we all make errors. The trick is to manage that error before it becomes consequential. And so this should tell you something very important, that once you start deviating from procedures, you're setting yourself up for problems. All right. And finally, the B in NTSB stands for be professional. What is a professional? I think being a professional, it's a mindset. It's the way that you think. Precise checklist usage, precise callouts, precise compliance with SOPs and regulations, keeping up with knowledge and skills, reading your aircraft manuals, rereading those, keeping up with your profession. And I think it's very important to say, you know, I don't know, or I need your help, or I'm wrong, to use good crew resource management. These are some things that in my 32 years of experience, I believe are critical to being a professional. So, okay, if you had to sum it up, Professionalism means that you are doing the right things, even when no one is watching. So think about that. Negative publicity avoidance. Take the most conservative approach. SOPs, follow them religiously, and be a professional. I think a free lesson that has been attributed to many goes like this. Learn from the mistakes of others. You won't live long enough to make them all yourself. And that is so true in aviation. So I finished a little late, started a little late. I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank our sponsors and everyone else. Have a great day. Today is going to be a very important day in the history of China's business aviation. Thank you very much.
Chairman Sumwalt, thank you very much. I know it took a lot of time to prepare for the event. Our biggest regret is that you are not here in person to be with us, but we hope you will visit China in the near future. And thank you very much again. You shared a lot of valuable information to all of us.
Jeff, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And I do look forward to coming back to China. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now it gives